Ask most people how New York City became the most powerful city in America, and you'll get some version of the same answer. It was destiny. A perfect natural harbor, a river running deep into the continent, a magnetic pull that simply made greatness inevitable from the very first day a European ship dropped anchor in its waters. New York, in this telling, was always going to be New York. It just took a while for the rest of the world to notice. There's just one problem. That story is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong, in a way that erases almost everything interesting about how this city actually came to exist. Let me say that again, because it matters. New York's dominance was never inevitable. For nearly 2 centuries, it wasn't even the most important city in its own colony, let alone the country. It was a fragile, mismanaged, almost abandoned trading post that nearly failed within its first decade. It was smaller than Boston. It was less influential than Philadelphia. It was, for a shockingly long stretch of its early life, an afterthought. What actually turned this afterthought into the financial capital of the world is a far stranger and more deliberate story than Great Harbor, obvious success. It involves a governor with a wooden leg who tried to ban an entire religion and got overruled by his own bosses purely for financial reasons. A defensive wall built to keep out an invasion that never actually came, whose name would eventually be worth more than the fortunes of entire nations. A canal so expensive and so mocked by its critics that it was nicknamed a folly, right up until the moment it single-handedly rewired the economic map of the continent. A group of stock traders who sealed one of the most consequential financial agreements in American history under a tree on a spring morning because they didn't have anywhere better to meet. And a political machine so openly corrupt that its leader eventually died in a debtor's prison, even though the public works his corruption financed are still standing today. And here's the part that should genuinely change how you think about cities in general. Not just this one. The same forces that built New York. Geography exploited by ambition. Waves of desperate immigration turned into cheap labor. And a political system that mixed genuine vision with outright theft are still the exact forces shaping which cities boom and which ones stagnate today. Think about that for a second before we dive in. When people talk about New York today, they talk about it the way people talk about a law of physics, as though its dominance were simply an unavoidable outcome of the universe arranging itself correctly. A big harbor, a central location. Of course, it became the biggest city in America. What else could possibly have happened? But that kind of thinking erases just how many times this city's rise could have been derailed entirely, and just how many other cities along the eastern seaboard had, at various points, perfectly reasonable claims to becoming what New York eventually became instead. Philadelphia was larger and more sophisticated for generations. Boston had deeper roots, a more established elite, and arguably a stronger claim to being the intellectual and financial center of colonial America. If a handful of specific decisions had gone differently, if a canal had never been dug, if immigration patterns had shifted even slightly, if a corrupt political boss had been exposed a decade earlier, you could very easily be watching a documentary right now about the fascinating rise of Philadelphia instead. So we're not going to start this story with skyscrapers. We're going to start it with a muddy, mosquito-plagued trading outpost at the very bottom of a small Dutch colony that almost nobody back in Europe thought was worth the investment. Now, here's the critical thing that most tourist histories skip entirely. Before there was a New York, and before there was even a new Amsterdam, this land belonged to the Lenape people, an Algonquian-speaking nation who had lived across this region for thousands of years, moving seasonally between fishing grounds, farmland, and hunting territory. The Lenape didn't see the island the Dutch would eventually call Manhattan as a single piece of real estate to be bought or sold in the European sense at all. Land in Lenape culture was something you used and shared, not something you permanently transferred to another party the way you'd hand over a horse or a barrel of grain. That single cultural misunderstanding, one side believing they were selling exclusive ownership, the other side believing they were agreeing to share resources, would define the earliest and most infamous transaction in New York's history. It's worth pausing on just how sophisticated Lenape society actually was because the popular imagination tends to flatten indigenous nations into a vague, undifferentiated backdrop for European arrival rather than treating them as the established, organized, deeply knowledgeable inhabitants they actually were. The Lenape maintained an intricate network of seasonal settlements across what's now the New York City region, cultivating corn, beans, and squash, the so-called Three Sisters planting system, while also fishing the region's extraordinarily rich waterways, harvesting oysters from beds so vast that early European visitors described oyster reefs in the harbor stretching for literal miles. Manhattan itself, in the Lenape language, is generally believed to derive from a word referring to the place of many hills, or alternatively, the place where wood is gathered for boughs. A small linguistic detail that quietly reminds you this island had a name, a use and a meaning for thousands of years before a single European ship arrived. In 1609, an Englishman named Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company while searching for a northwest passage to Asia, guided his ship the Half Moon into the harbor and up the river that would eventually bear his name. He never found his passage to Asia. What he found instead was something the Dutch back home would come to value far more immediately, an extraordinarily rich beaver pelt trading region, at a time when European fashion had created an almost insatiable demand for beaver fur felt hats. 15 years later, in 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a small trading post on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, naming it New Amsterdam. And I want you to really sit with how small this operation actually was. We're not talking about a grand colonial city with ambitions of empire. We're talking about a fur trading company town, established primarily to extract a single commodity as efficiently and cheaply as possible, staffed by company employees rather than settlers pursuing religious freedom or personal opportunity the way the Puritans up in Massachusetts were. By the 1630s, the entire population of New Amsterdam numbered only a few hundred people, crammed into a rough scattering of wooden buildings clustered near the harbor, entirely dependent on supply ships from Amsterdam for many basic necessities, and governed by company administrators whose primary loyalty was to shareholders back in the Netherlands rather than to the well-being of the colonists actually living on the ground. This wasn't a city being built with any long-term vision of grandeur. It was a warehouse with a fence around it, and for its first several decades, there was absolutely nothing about its trajectory that suggested it would ever become anything more. By the 1630s, the entire population of New Amsterdam numbered only a few hundred people, crammed into a rough scattering of wooden buildings clustered near the harbor, entirely dependent on supply ships from Amsterdam for many basic necessities, and governed by company administrators whose primary loyalty was to shareholders back in the Netherlands rather than to the well-being of the colonists actually living on the ground. This wasn't a city being built with any long-term vision of grandeur. It was a warehouse with a fence around it, and for its first several decades, there was absolutely nothing about its trajectory that suggested it would ever become anything more. Part 1. The purchase that wasn't quite what you think now. Let's talk about the moment everyone already thinks they know. The purchase of Manhattan. The popular version goes like this. The Dutch bought the entire island of Manhattan from Native Americans for $24 worth of beads and trinkets, in what has become shorthand across pop culture for a catastrophically lopsided deal, a symbol of naive or foolish natives being swindled by shrewd European traders. Part 1. The purchase that wasn't quite what you think here. Is the critical thing that gets left out almost every single time this story gets told. The actual transaction, recorded in a letter dated November 1626, describes the value exchanged as 60 guilders worth of goods, not dollars. Not $24, but 60 guilders in trade goods, likely including tools, cloth, and metal items useful for daily survival, items that from a Lenape perspective may have represented meaningful and fair value at the time, particularly since, as we already discussed, they likely understood the arrangement as permission to share and use the land rather than a permanent, exclusive transfer of ownership in the European legal sense. The $24 figure itself wasn't even calculated until the 19th century, when a historian converted the old guilder value into a modern dollar estimate, a number that has since been repeated so many times in textbooks and trivia nights and tourist tours that it has essentially replaced the real, messier, more culturally fraught transaction that actually occurred. This matters, and not just as historical trivia. It matters because the mythology of the greatest real estate deal in history frames New York's origin story as one of clever, inevitable triumph, smart Europeans outmaneuvering naive locals to seize a prize destined for greatness. The reality is a story of two fundamentally different worldviews colliding, a transaction whose meaning was contested from the very moment it happened, and a colony that for its first several decades showed absolutely no signs of becoming anything more than a marginal, struggling outpost. There's also a deeper irony buried in this story that rarely gets acknowledged. The Lenape band involved in the 1626 transaction likely wasn't even the group with the primary, ongoing claim to Manhattan itself. Some historical accounts suggest the negotiating party may have belonged to a different local group entirely, meaning the Dutch may have purchased land from people who didn't have exclusive standing to grant it away in the first place, even by European standards. Disputes and tensions over land, resources, and mutual misunderstanding between Dutch settlers and various Lenape groups would continue for decades, eventually erupting into a series of brutal, often Dutch-initiated conflicts in the 1640s, known collectively as Kieft's War, named after the particularly aggressive and paranoid Director General who ordered a series of massacres against Lenape communities that had, in several documented cases, sought Dutch protection rather than posed any active military threat. It's a grim, largely forgotten chapter that sits uncomfortably beneath the folksy, sanitized story of beads and trinkets most people grow up hearing, and that marginal, struggling outpost was about to be run by one of the strangest and most contradictory figures in American colonial history. Part 2. The governor who tried to ban everyone. He didn't like. Now let's move to the man who would come to define New Amsterdam's final and most dramatic Dutch years. Peter Stuyvesant. Stuyvesant arrived in New Amsterdam in 1647 as Director General of the colony, having previously lost a leg in a military campaign in the Caribbean, a wound that earned him the nickname Peg Leg Pete. Among the colonists, he would go on to govern with an iron, if partially wooden, fist. He was rigid, deeply religious in the strict Dutch Reformed tradition, and almost comically intolerant of anyone who didn't share his particular worldview. He arrived promising to reform a colony that his predecessor had left in genuine administrative chaos, plagued by drunkenness, disorganized defense, and a population that had grown accustomed to largely ignoring whatever rules the company's representatives tried to impose from their small fort at the island's tip. In 1654, when a small group of 23 Jewish refugees arrived in New Amsterdam fleeing Portuguese persecution in Brazil, Stuyvesant tried to have them expelled entirely, writing to his superiors at the Dutch West India Company back in Amsterdam that Jews were a deceitful race who should not be allowed to infect and trouble this new colony. It's about as blunt an example of institutional prejudice as you'll find in early American history. He similarly attempted to restrict Quakers and Lutherans from openly practicing their faiths within the colony, viewing religious uniformity as essential to maintaining social order in a settlement he considered dangerously fragile and undisciplined. Here's the twist that almost never makes it into the simplified version of this story. The company's directors in Amsterdam overruled him, not primarily out of some enlightened commitment to religious tolerance, but for a far more pragmatic and, in its own way, more revealing reason. Several of the company's own investors were Jewish, and the directors recognized that a colony known for religious persecution would struggle to attract the diverse, motivated settlers and merchants it desperately needed to become commercially viable. Tolerance, in other words, wasn't imposed as a moral principle. It was imposed as a business strategy. This pattern, economic pragmatism repeatedly winning out over ideological purity, would become one of the defining, if underappreciated, threads running through New York's entire history. Long before anyone used the phrase money talks, New Amsterdam's very survival depended on the fact that money, quite literally, talked its way past the prejudices of the man running the place. And Stuyvesant's authoritarian instincts didn't stop with religion. He restricted the sale of alcohol, tried to regulate nearly every aspect of daily commerce, and ruled largely by decree rather than consultation with the colonists themselves. A governing style that, over time, alienated the very population he needed to keep the colony functioning and defended. Which brings us to 1664, and the moment New Amsterdam stopped being Dutch at all. Part 3. A colony surrendered without a single shot now. Here's the critical thing that surprises almost everyone who assumes New York's transition from Dutch to English rule involved some kind of dramatic battle. It didn't. In August of 1664, 4 English warships sailed into New Amsterdam's harbor, sent by King Charles II's brother, the Duke of York, who had been granted the entire territory as a gift despite the fact that the Dutch, not the English, were the ones actually living there. Stuyvesant, characteristically, wanted to fight. He wanted to resist. He drafted defiant letters and rallied what militia he could, reportedly tearing up an English ultimatum in a fit of rage, before his own council members quietly retrieved the pieces and pieced the document back together so the colonists could actually read the terms being offered. But the colonists themselves, merchants who had grown wealthy under relatively loose Dutch commercial regulation, and who suspected correctly that English rule might actually offer them even more favorable trading terms with the wider English colonial network stretching down the Atlantic coast, refused to fight. Facing a population unwilling to risk their lives and property defending Dutch sovereignty, Stuyvesant was forced to surrender the colony without firing a single shot. The English promptly renamed it New York, after the Duke of York himself, and the peg-legged governor who had once tried to ban an entire religious community found himself negotiating the terms of his own irrelevance. Remarkably, Stuyvesant would go on to spend the remainder of his life quietly living out his days on a farm in what's now the East Village, seemingly making peace with the very English rule he had once so furiously resisted, a strange, almost anticlimactic epilogue for a man whose earlier career had been defined by rigid, uncompromising authority. And here's something genuinely striking about this transition that challenges the assumption that a change in colonial ownership meant a wholesale cultural replacement. New York remained deeply, visibly Dutch for generations after the English took formal control. Dutch families like the Roosevelts, the Van Rensselaers, and the Stuyvesants themselves continued to hold enormous social and economic influence well into the 18th and even 19th centuries, a legacy that would eventually produce 2 American presidents bearing the Roosevelt name, Dutch architectural styles, Dutch place names, and even the distinctive layout of Lower Manhattan's crooked, seemingly illogical streets, which frustrate tourists using modern grid-based logic to this day, trace directly back to the original unplanned cow paths and property lines of New Amsterdam. In fact, if you've ever wondered why the southern tip of Manhattan feels like a confusing maze compared to the orderly numbered grid further uptown, you're experiencing living, walkable evidence of a Dutch trading post that nobody ever bothered to redesign, layered underneath centuries of English, and later American, expansion. But English rule brought something else with it too, something far more consequential than a new flag flying over the harbor. It brought a defensive structure that would eventually give its name to the single most powerful financial address on the planet. Part 4. The wall that became worth more than nations now. Overlaying this transition was a physical structure that had actually been built years earlier, under Dutch rule, for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with finance. In 1653, fearing a possible attack from English colonists to the north or hostile indigenous nations following years of brutal, often Dutch-initiated conflict, the colonial government ordered the construction of a defensive wooden wall along the northern edge of the settlement, roughly along the boundary of what is today one of the most famous Streets in the entire world. That's right. Wall Street is named quite literally after a wall, a defensive barrier built out of fear, not out of ambition. It never actually repelled an invasion. No serious attack ever came. And the wall was eventually torn down by the English in 1699, its timber reportedly repurposed for other construction around the growing city. A fittingly unglamorous end for a structure that would nonetheless leave behind the most famous street name in the history of global finance. But the name stuck. And more than a century later, in 1792, a group of 24 New York stockbrokers gathered beneath a buttonwood tree at 68 Wall Street and signed an agreement that would define American finance for the next 2 centuries. The Buttonwood Agreement, as it became known, established fixed commission rates among the signatories and created the framework that would eventually formalize into the New York Stock Exchange. The agreement itself was remarkably brief, just 2 sentences long, a stark contrast to the sprawling regulatory apparatus that would eventually govern the very institution it created. And it was born less out of grand financial vision than out of a practical desire. A small group of brokers to shut out unregulated, less scrupulous competitors who had been undercutting their commissions on the open steps of a nearby auction house. Picture that scene for a moment. Not a marble temple of finance with soaring columns. Not a trading floor buzzing with screens and tickers. Just 24 men standing under a tree on a street named after a barrier built to keep out an enemy that never showed up, agreeing on the basic rules of a market that would eventually move more capital in a single day than most nations, generate in a year. It's one of history's more delicious ironies, that the street synonymous with global capitalism owes its name not to commerce or ambition, but to fear and defense, a physical barrier meant to keep the world out, which instead became the address the entire world would eventually have to answer to. And this transformation from defensive frontier outpost to financial capital didn't happen smoothly or peacefully. It happened through a war that very nearly burned the entire city to the ground. Part 5. The city that burned and the war that wouldn't let go. Now let's move to the Revolutionary War, a period during which New York City's role gets dramatically underplayed in most popular retellings, which tend to focus almost entirely on Boston, Philadelphia, and the eventual battlefields of Yorktown. In the summer of 1776, New York became the site of the largest battle of the entire Revolutionary War up to that point, the Battle of Long Island, also called the Battle of Brooklyn, in which General George Washington's poorly trained, undersupplied Continental Army faced off against a British force of more than 30,000 soldiers and sailors, the largest expeditionary force the British Empire had ever assembled up to that time. Washington chose to defend New York in the first place largely for symbolic and strategic reasons. Losing the city without a fight so early in the war risked shattering fragile American morale and signaling to potential European allies that the rebellion had no realistic chance of success. Washington lost badly. His forces were nearly encircled and could easily have been captured or destroyed entirely, which would have almost certainly ended the American Revolution before it had truly begun. Only a daring nighttime evacuation across the East River, conducted under cover of fog, allowed Washington's army to escape to Manhattan and eventually retreat further north, living to fight another day. Historians have long noted that had the wind and weather cooperated with the British fleet that night, rather than the retreating Americans, Washington himself, along with much of the Continental Army's remaining leadership, could plausibly have been captured on the spot. A single shift in the weather that could have ended the entire war in Britain's favor within its first summer. New York. City itself fell to British occupation shortly afterward, and just weeks into that occupation, a massive fire, the origins of which remain genuinely disputed by historians to this day, with some attributing it to accident, and others suspecting deliberate American sabotage, designed to deny the British a comfortable base of operations, swept through the city and destroyed roughly a quarter to a third of all buildings in New York, including the original Trinity Church. The British would go on to hold New York City for the remainder of the war, nearly 7 full years, Longer than any other major American city remained under British control. It became the central hub for British military operations in North America, a place where loyalist refugees from across the colonies fled for safety, and a city whose population, paradoxically, actually swelled under wartime occupation even as fire, disease, and military rule made daily life increasingly difficult for those who remained. Overcrowded prison ships anchored in the East River, most infamously the HMS Jersey, held thousands of captured American soldiers and sailors in conditions so brutal that historians now estimate more. American prisoners died aboard these floating prisons, then were killed in every land battle of the Revolutionary War combined. A grim, largely forgotten statistic that rarely makes it into New York's celebratory founding mythology. When British forces finally evacuated in November of 1783, a date New Yorkers celebrated for well over a century afterward as Evacuation Day, a holiday that has since faded almost entirely from public memory despite once rivaling the 4th of July in local significance. The city they left behind was scarred, economically devastated, and stripped of a huge percentage of its pre-war population and infrastructure. And yet, within barely a decade of that devastation, this same battered, burned-out port city would briefly become the capital of an entire new nation. Mid-script synthesis, the pieces nobody expected to fit together. Now let's pause here and put the pieces we've gathered so far next to each other, because the true shape of New York's rise only becomes visible once you do. You had a scrappy Dutch fur trading outpost, never designed as anything more than a commercial extraction point, whose earliest layout, random, crooked, unplanned, still physically shapes the city today. You had a governor who tried to enforce religious conformity and was overruled purely because intolerance was bad for business, establishing a template of pragmatic tolerance that would repeat itself again and again across the centuries. You had a bloodless surrender to the English that nonetheless preserved deep, lasting Dutch cultural and economic influence for generations. You had a defensive wall built out of fear rather than ambition, whose name would eventually anchor the financial capital of the world. And you had a devastating war and occupation that burned a third of the city to the ground and drove away much of its population, only for that same city to rebuild itself as the temporary seat of the newly formed United States government just a few short years later. None of this reads like destiny. It reads like improvisation, a series of chaotic, contingent events, each one reshaping what came before it, none of them individually pointing toward inevitable greatness. And this is exactly the pattern that continues over and over as New York claws its way toward economic dominance over the following century. Part 6. A capital city for barely a year now. Here's something that surprises a lot of people. New York City was, for a brief and often overlooked period, the actual capital of the United States. In April of 1789, George Washington took his oath of office as the first president of the United States on the balcony of Federal Hall, located on Wall Street itself, that same street named after that same defensive barrier we talked about a few minutes ago. New York served as the seat of the federal government from 1785 to 1790, hosting the first sessions of Congress under the new Constitution and functioning, briefly, as the political heart of the entire American experiment. During this brief window, the city buzzed with an energy entirely different from its earlier mercantile character. Foreign diplomats, congressional delegates, and the new nation's earliest political factions all converged on a relatively small, dense port city that suddenly found itself hosting the entire machinery of a brand new republic. And then, in 1790, as part of a political compromise often called the Compromise of 1790, negotiated at a now famous private dinner between Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, in which the federal government agreed to assume state Revolutionary War debts in exchange for locating the permanent national capital along the Potomac River. Closer to the agrarian South, the capital moved first to Philadelphia temporarily, and eventually to the newly built city of Washington. It's a genuinely remarkable historical footnote that the entire question of where the United States government would permanently reside was settled, in significant part, over a dinner table negotiation involving three men who each had their own competing regional and financial interests at stake. New York lost its status as the political capital of the nation permanently. But here's the critical thing that most retellings of this moment completely miss. Losing the political capital didn't hurt New York nearly as much as anyone might have expected at the time. If anything, it freed the city to pursue an entirely different kind of dominance. Not political power, but economic and financial power, unburdened by the responsibilities and constraints of also having to function as the seat of federal government. While Washington built marble monuments and grappled with the slow, deliberate machinery of legislation, New York quietly built docks, warehouses, and trading houses. It chased commerce instead of ceremony. And within a few decades, that single-minded pursuit of trade and capital would pay off in a way that permanently reshaped the economic geography of the entire continent. Part 7. The ditch that everyone mocked until it made New York unstoppable. Now let's move to what might be the single most underappreciated infrastructure project in American history, the Erie Canal. By the early 1800s, New York City was a significant port, but it was not yet the dominant port in America. Philadelphia and Boston remained fierce commercial rivals, each with their own claims to economic primacy, and the interior of the American continent, the vast, resource-rich Ohio Valley and Great Lakes region, remained frustratingly disconnected from any Atlantic port by anything faster or cheaper than slow, expensive overland wagon transport. New York's governor at the time, DeWitt Clinton, became obsessed with an audacious solution: a canal, more than 360 miles long, connecting the Hudson River.